Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that most of us think we understand on the surface, but when you really dig in, reveals some surprising complexities. Perfectionism.
Hmm.
We've gathered a fascinating array of research to really unpack what this concept means in psychology, going, far beyond just someone who likes their desk tidy.
Right. And to immediately bring this into focus, maybe think about someone like Stanley Kubrick,
Oh yeah, the filmmaker.
the legendary filmmaker. His professional perfectionism is, well, it's pretty well known, part of his intense dedication. It makes you wonder, what's the psychological engine driving that kind of relentless pursuit?
Exactly. And that's what we're here to explore. Psychologically, our sources define perfectionism as a really broad personality trait.
Right.
It's characterized by a deep concern with achieving flawlessness, coupled with a tendency for harsh self-criticism and a real preoccupation with how others might evaluate us.
Yeah, and what's key, I think, is that modern psychology understands this isn't a simple on-off switch. It's a multifaceted thing with many different layers.
So initially, there was this idea that perfectionism could have both a bright side and a dark side. You'd hear talk of healthy versus unhealthy perfectionism, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But as we've delved deeper into the research, the picture that emerges is often more intricate and frequently quite a bit gloomier than that initial simple distinction.
Okay, let's dive into that gluier side then. The term often used is maladaptive perfectionism.
Yeah.
What exactly does that look like in practice?
Well, maladaptive perfectionism is essentially this unyielding chase after ideals that are just impossible to reach, setting goals that are fundamentally unrealistic.
Okay.
And the impact on well-being is significant. We see strong links to various adjustment issues, things like depression, anxiety,
Mm.
and even connections to conditions like ADHD, OCD, and OCPD. It also takes a real toll on self-esteem.
That sounds pretty impactful. Does the research suggest even more serious consequences than that?
Unfortunately, yes. These kinds of difficulties with adjustment can escalate to really concerning levels, frequently contributing to suicidal thoughts and even tendencies.
Wow.
Furthermore, maladaptive perfectionism isn't isolated. It can contribute to a wider spectrum of psychological, physical, social, and even problems related to achievement across all age groups.
It almost feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think striving for perfection in certain areas might actually reduce stress for some people.
You might think that.
Yet, the overall trend seems to be that perfectionistic tendencies are becoming more prevalent, particularly among younger people. Our sources highlight data from British psychologists Thomas Curran and Andrew Hill, who've actually tracked this rise.
Yeah, and what's really striking is how this plays out in behavior. Maladaptive perfectionists often get caught in this relentless, compulsive cycle, pushing towards goals that are simply unattainable.
Right.
Their sense of self-worth becomes completely intertwined with their productivity and accomplishments, often at the expense of other crucial aspects of their lives.
So everything else falls away.
It can, yeah. And this intense internal pressure almost inevitably leads to feelings of disappointment and incredibly severe self-criticism.
And then there's this term I encountered that really captures the feeling, perfectionary paralysis. Can you explain what that means?
Ah, perfectionary paralysis. It's when the drive for flawlessness becomes so overpowering that it actually prevents someone from completing their work altogether.
So you just stop.
You just stop. The desire for absolute perfection becomes such a monumental hurdle that making any progress feels impossible. Think of it as the extreme ends of both creative block and, like, analysis paralysis merging into one paralyzing state.
Okay, so it sounds like early attempts were made to categorize perfectionism.
Hmm.
Let's talk about D.E. Hamachek's distinction from way back in 1978.
Right. Hamachek proposed a distinction between what he called normal and neurotic perfectionism.
Okay.
His idea was that normal perfectionists pursue high standards, but they don't let it damage their self-esteem, and they actually find satisfaction, pleasure in the effort they put in.
And the neurotic type. That doesn't sound very healthy.
Exactly. According to Hamachek, neurotic perfectionists set these incredibly unrealistic goals and then feel a profound sense of dissatisfaction and inadequacy when they inevitably fall short.
Which they're bound to do if the goals are unrealistic.
Pretty much. Interestingly, Hamachek did offer some suggestions for how to shift away from these maladaptive patterns towards healthier behaviors, although our main focus here is really on understanding the core concepts.
It's interesting, though, that even with more modern research, this basic differentiation seems to kind of hold up, even if the terminology has evolved somewhat.
Precisely. We see different labels being used now, positive striving versus maladaptive evaluation concerns, or active versus passive perfectionism, and indeed adaptive versus maladaptive perfectionism.
Really?
They're all trying to capture these different aspects of the same underlying tendency. And it's also worth remembering that someone might exhibit perfectionistic tendencies in their professional life, but be much more relaxed in their personal relationships.
Oh, so it can vary.
Yeah, absolutely. It highlights that perfectionism isn't necessarily uniform across all areas of life.
Now, this idea of adaptive perfectionism, it sounds like it should be the positive side, right? But our sources seem to really challenge that notion.
That's a crucial point to understand, yeah. While the term itself implies a healthy form of perfectionism, recent research has actually linked it to some surprisingly negative outcomes.
Like what?
Things like suicidal thoughts, depression, eating disorders, poor physical health, and even a higher risk of early death.
Wow. That's a pretty concerning list of associations. It really makes you question how something linked to such serious problems could ever be considered adaptive.
That's exactly the core of the counter-argument that many researchers now make. They contend that there's really no solid scientific evidence to support the existence of a truly healthy form of perfectionism.
So what is it then, if it's not healthy perfectionism?
Well, they argue that what's often labeled as adaptive perfectionism seems to have very little to do with actual perfectionism and is much more akin to simply striving for excellence.
Okay, so it's about the motivation and the underlying mindset, isn't it? Pushing yourself to be your best versus this, like, relentless, often self-critical pursuit of an impossible ideal.
Precisely. Perfectionism is really characterized by this unyielding drive towards expectations that are so unreasonably high they're rarely, if ever, met.
Right.
Coupled with a deep-seated fear and avoidance of any imperfection, this is fundamentally different from striving for excellence, which involves aiming high, but in a more balanced and, frankly, achievable way.
So it's really important to understand that perfectionism isn't just another way of saying excellence or even conscientiousness.
Absolutely not. In fact, many experts now advise against using the term adaptive perfectionism when talking about this personality trait because it can be quite misleading.
Okay. However, some research does still use adaptive in contrast to maladaptive, right? What's the context in those cases? I mean, why keep the term?
Yeah, and that often occurs when researchers are looking at how these different facets of perfectionism relate to the big five personality traits.
Ah, the big five.
For those not familiar, the Big Five is a model that describes personality across five broad dimensions. In this context, adaptive perfectionism has sometimes been found to correlate with traits like openness, conscientiousness, and extroversion.
Which sound pretty positive.
They do, whereas maladaptive perfectionism tends to show a stronger link to neuroticism.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of sense. So there are different ways of dissecting these concepts.
Hmm.
Tell me about Stober and Otto's two main dimensions of perfectionism.
Right. Stober and Otto proposed a model that focuses on two key dimensions: perfectionist strivings and perfectionist concerns.
Strivings and concerns, okay.
Perfectionist strivings encompass those aspects that might initially seem positive, setting high personal standards and working diligently to achieve them. Perfectionist concerns, on the other hand, really focus on the negative elements, like being overly worried about making mistakes and being excessively self-critical.
And how do these two dimensions play out in different individuals? Are there patterns?
Their model suggests a few different profiles, yeah. You have healthy perfectionists who are high in their strivings but low in their concerns. They aim high but aren't debilitated by the fear of failure.
That sounds manageable.
It does. Then there are unhealthy perfectionists who score high in both strivings and concerns. This is the classic picture of someone who is driven but also highly anxious and self-critical.
Got it.
And finally, you have non-perfectionists who are generally low in perfectionist strivings overall.
It sounds like their initial research suggested some potential positives associated with those strivings, like higher self-esteem or maybe better academic outcomes.
That's what their initial review of the literature suggested, yes. They proposed that those high in perfectionist strivings tended to show greater self-esteem, agreeableness, academic success, and even more positive social interactions, along with fewer psychological and physical health issues.
This sounds like a but coming.
There is a really important but. Subsequent, more rigorous meta-analytic reviews, which look at the combined data from many different studies, have largely failed to consistently support these positive claims. The weight of the current evidence really points towards a more negative overall impact of perfectionism, even the striving part when it's truly perfectionistic.
This is all painting a very detailed and at times quite complex picture. To try and get a really comprehensive understanding, let's talk about the comprehensive model of perfectionism, or CMPB.
Right, the CMPB, it offers a really in-depth, multi-layered view of perfectionism as a personality style. It breaks it down into three interconnected levels: the trait level, the self-presentational level, and the cognitive level.
Okay, let's unpack those one at a time. What are the key aspects at the trait level?
Okay, so at the trait level, the CMPB includes concepts like self-oriented perfectionism, which is essentially about demanding perfection from oneself.
Mm.
Pretty straightforward. Then there's socially prescribed perfectionism, which is the feeling that you absolutely need to be perfect in order to gain acceptance and approval from others based on what you think they expect.
Right, their perceived expectations.
Exactly. And finally, other-oriented perfectionism, where the primary focus is on expecting and demanding perfection from other people.
That socially prescribed aspect sounds like it could be a huge source of pressure. What about the self-presentational level? How you show it?
Yeah, this level deals with how perfectionists express their tendencies in their interactions with others, focusing on how they manage impressions and monitor their own behavior. It's really about the need to appear perfect,
The appearance, okay?
rather than actually achieving some objective state of perfection. This includes behaviors like perfectionist self-promotion, where someone actively tries to project a flawless, often inaccurate image.
Like curating their image constantly.
Constantly. There's also non-display of imperfection, which involves actively concealing any attributes or behaviors that might be seen as less than perfect, like hiding mistakes from others.
And lastly, non-disclosure of imperfection, which is about avoiding talking about personal flaws or failures. The underlying idea is that these self-presentational strategies are employed as a defense mechanism against feelings of low self-worth and the deep-seated fear of rejection.
So it's almost like putting on a constant performance. It sounds exhausting.
It really does.
And what about the cognitive level in the CMPB, the thinking part?
The cognitive level focuses on the internal, thought-based aspects of perfectionism, those constant ruminations and perfectionistic thoughts.
Right.
It involves a persistent worry about needing to be perfect, harsh self-recriminations when they perceive they've fallen short, and a continuous focus on the gap between their actual self and their idealized perfect self.
Yeah.
It's really about the information processing that's colored by this need for perfection.
And these levels aren't separate, are they? They interact.
Exactly. It's important to remember that these three levels trait, self-presentational and cognitive, are distinct, but they influence each other, and they can manifest in really individual and unique ways from person to person.
Yeah.
What we see across these levels is a consistent theme. An internal drive for flawlessness, that's the trait. A need to project that flawlessness externally, self-presentational, and a constant internal dialogue reinforcing that need and punishing any deviation, cognitive. This interconnectedness is really what makes perfectionism so pervasive and challenging.
That paints a much more intricate picture. Now, our sources also mentioned the perfectionism social disconnection model, the PSDM. That sounds like it specifically looks at how perfectionism impacts our relationships.
Exactly. The PSDM is a dynamic model that specifically examines perfectionism within the context of interpersonal relationships and the consequences it can have.
Okay.
The core idea is that perfectionism, through behaviors like appearing aloof and inauthentic, actually leads to the very social disconnection and rejection that perfectionists are desperately trying to avoid in the first place. It's a bit of a paradox.
It really is. How does this sense of disconnection develop according to the model? Where does it start? The model proposes that it often begins in early childhood with what they term interpersonal asynchrony between the child and their primary caregiver, essentially a lack of fit between the child's natural temperament and how the caregiver responds to their needs.
Like they're out of sync.
Exactly, like a dance where the partners are constantly out of step. This can lead to the child's fundamental needs for belonging, acceptance, and a positive sense of self not being fully met, causing them to develop a view of themselves as somehow inherently defective.
Wow, that's deep. So in that context, perfectionism becomes a kind of strategy to cope with those unmet needs, a way to try and fix that feeling.
That's the central idea of the PSDM, yes. Perfectionism develops as a way to try and fulfill those deep-seated needs for belonging and self-esteem. By striving to be, or at least to appear, flawless, the individual hopes to avoid judgment and rejection from others.
So it backfires.
Often, yeah. As we touched on, this rigid, emotionally distant, and self-concealing way of relating often has the opposite effect, actually increasing feelings of alienation and the likelihood of rejection.
So the solution becomes the problem.
In a nutshell, yes. The very thing the perfectionist believes will solve their social disconnection ends up being a major cause of it. And this feeling of estrangement from both themselves and others is strongly linked to negative outcomes like difficulties in forming and maintaining healthy relationships, increased risk of depression, and even a higher risk of suicide.
This is all quite heavy stuff. It makes you wonder how psychologists actually go about measuring such a complex set of traits and tendencies.
Yeah, it's a challenge. But there are several well-established and widely used measurement scales. One of the earliest and perhaps most influential is the Frost Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale, or FMPS.
Okay, the FMPS.
This scale assesses 6 different dimensions of perfectionism, including an individual's concern over making mistakes, the presence of high personal standards, their perception of high parental expectations and criticism.
Ah, the parental influence.
Right. And also their tendency to doubt the quality of their own actions and their preference for order and organization.
And another one that came up was the Hewitt and Flett Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale. How does that one differ in its approach? Is it measuring the same things?
It's similar but focuses on 3 key aspects.
Hmm.
Self-oriented perfectionism, which is about setting unrealistic standards for oneself. Other-oriented perfectionism, which involves holding unrealistic expectations for others.
Nice, and pointing it outwards.
Exactly. And socially prescribed perfectionism, which is that feeling that one absolutely must meet the perceived high expectations of significant others in their lives. The example of parents pushing their children very hard really illustrates that socially prescribed dimension.
Yeah, you can see that.
And interestingly, researchers have noted some conceptual overlap between Frost's focus on high personal standards and concern over mistakes, and Hewitt and Flett's dimensions of self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism.
So they're getting at similar underlying constructs.
It seems so. While different scales focus on slightly different facets, they all seem to circle back to this core tension between high standards and a fear of not meeting them, often fueled by external pressures or internal self-criticism.
We also heard about the Perfectionist Self-Presentation Scale, the PSPS. That one seems to tie directly into the CMPB we discussed earlier, right? The performance aspect.
Exactly. The PSPS is specifically designed to assess those interpersonal components of the CMPB that we talked about: perfectionist self-promotion, non-display of imperfection, and non-disclosure of imperfection.
Oh.
It really looks at how individuals express their perfectionistic tendencies in their interactions with others, and importantly, scores on this scale have been consistently linked to higher levels of psychological distress.
So putting on that front takes a toll.
It really suggests that these self-presentational strategies, while intended to protect, are often quite maladaptive. So the PSPS really highlights the performative aspect of perfectionism. It's not just about internal standards, but also about this intense pressure to appear perfect to others.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about the Perfectionism Cognitions Inventory, the PCI? That one seems to delve into the specific thought patterns associated with perfectionism, like what's going on inside their head moment to moment.
Yes, the PCI focuses on the cognitive level of perfectionism, those automatic, often negative thoughts that revolve around the need to be perfect.
Right.
It includes statements that tap into things like social comparison, a heightened awareness of one's own imperfections and failures, and the constant striving to meet unrealistic standards. Unlike some of the other scales that focus on more stable personality traits, the PCI is designed to capture these thoughts in different situations and at different times.
So it's more situational.
Exactly, making it more of a measure of state-like cognitions. Higher scores on the PCI are associated with a greater frequency of negative automatic thought and a stronger tendency towards self-criticism and self-blame.
Okay. The Almost Perfect Scale Revised, the APSR, also came up. What are its key measures? How does that fit in?
The APSR classifies individuals based on 3 key measures: high standards, order, and discrepancy.
Discrepancy.
Yeah, that last one, discrepancy, is really considered the core negative aspect of perfectionism as measured by this scale. It reflects the extent to which individuals believe that their own high standards are not being met.
The gap between the ideal and reality.
Pretty much. People who score high on the discrepancy subscale tend to report greater social stress and anxiety, which likely reflects those persistent feelings of falling short.
But there's some debate about this scale.
There is, yeah. There's been some ongoing debate in the research community about whether the high standards subscale of the APSR truly captures the essence of maladaptive perfectionism.
Or just high standards.
Right, with some studies suggesting it might simply be measuring generally high achievement standards rather than the more rigid and self-critical aspects we often associate with perfectionism. There are also some methodological concerns related to the discrepancy subscale, as it includes terms related to negative mood, which could potentially inflate its relationship with measures of neuroticism.
Right. It might be measuring mood and the discrepancy.
Potentially, yeah. It muddies the waters a bit.
And finally, we heard about the physical appearance perfectionism scale, the
Yeah.
PAPS. That seems like a very specific application of the concept,
It is. The PPS focuses very specifically on the desire and drive for a perfect physical appearance.
which seems very relevant today.
Extremely. It consists of two subscales. Worry about imperfection, which taps into the more negative aspects like excessive concern about one's appearance and engagement in strict body control behaviors,
Hmm.
and hope for perfection, which is associated with more positive self-perceptions and a focus on impression management related to appearance. However, it's worth noting that the PAPS hasn't been as extensively validated through research as some of the other more established perfectionism scales.
Okay. It's really striking how many different lenses researchers use to try to understand and measure this multifaceted trait. Now, let's move on to explore some of the broader psychological implications and consequences of perfectionism.
Sure. One really interesting psychological tendency often seen in perfectionists is that they have a difficult time acknowledging their own perceived flaws
Right.
and can actually become quite critical, even hypocritical, of others. It's almost as if they project their own insecurities outward, needing to maintain this outward image of virtue to compensate for their internal feelings of inadequacy.
That's fascinating. And the research seems to indicate a pretty strong link between perfectionism and various mental disorders, which we touched on.
Absolutely. The role of perfectionism has been investigated in a wide range of mental health conditions, including depression, various anxiety disorders, eating disorders, autism spectrum disorder, certain personality disorders, and even suicide risk. Interestingly, the specific dimensions of perfectionism, as measured by scales like the multidimensional perfectionism scale, can be differentially associated with the risk and severity of these different conditions.
So it matters which aspect of perfectionism is high.
It seems to matter, yes. For instance, research has shown a link between higher levels of socially prescribed perfectionism in young women and greater dissatisfaction with their body image, as well as a tendency to avoid social situations where their appearance might be scrutinized.
We also touched earlier on how perfectionism might be on the rise. Does it also influence how people cope with stress and challenges in their lives? Their coping mechanisms.
Yes, research suggests that perfectionists tend to favor more passive or avoidance-based coping strategies when they're faced with difficulties.
So they avoid the problem.
Often, yeah. Or they might engage in wishful thinking rather than active problem solving. They also show a greater tendency to rely on self-criticism as a way of trying to cope.
Which doesn't sound like coping at all.
Well, it really underscores the idea that self-criticism is a central and often damaging component of perfectionism. It's like their go-to response.
It sounds like a really unhealthy cycle that can perpetuate itself. What are some of the other negative ways perfectionism can manifest?
Beyond what we've already discussed, perfectionism can contribute to procrastination.
Which seems odd, doesn't it? You'd think they'd be hyper-organized.
It does seem odd, but it's often a way to avoid tasks where they fear they won't be able to perform flawlessly. If you don't start, you can't fail.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
They might also engage in self-deprecating behavior as a form of self-handicapping, almost preemptively excusing potential poor performance to protect their underlying sense of competence.
Giving themselves an out beforehand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The constant pressure to meet those impossibly high internal standards creates significant internal conflict and cognitive dissonance when those expectations inevitably aren't met.
Mm.
And as the perfectionism social disconnection model highlights, these rigid and often critical interpersonal patterns can lead to feelings of alienation and genuine social disconnection. It's a self-defeating pattern where the pursuit of perfect connection actually drives people away.
The link between perfectionism and suicide is particularly concerning, as you mentioned, given the severity of that outcome.
It is a deeply concerning connection, and one getting more attention. Perfectionism is increasingly recognized as a significant risk factor for suicidal ideation and attempts.
Why is the link so strong?
It seems to be the combination of setting excessively high and often unattainable self-expectations, engaging in relentless and harsh self-criticism when those expectations aren't met, and the compelling need to present a flawless outward image.
Which stops them asking for help.
Exactly. That presentation ironically makes it less likely that they will reach out for help when they desperately need it, creating a really dangerous situation.
And do different aspects of perfectionism play different roles here?
It seems so. The specific dimensions matter. Perfectionist drivings have been associated more with suicidal thoughts or ideation,
Okay.
while perfectionist concerns appear to be a stronger predictor of both suicidal ideation and actual attempts.
Wow.
And socially prescribed perfectionism, in particular, that feeling of needing to meet others' expectations, seems to have a particularly harmful effect on long-term suicidal thinking.
The connection with anorexia nervosa also seems to be quite strong and well documented in the sources.
Absolutely. Even early researchers who studied anorexia nervosa observed the rigid and hyperconscious patterns of behavior so often seen in individuals with the disorder,
Hmm.
along with a noticeable tendency towards neatness and a certain stubbornness characteristics that led some to describe them as being, and this is a quote, a rank perfectionist.
Wow, rank perfectionist.
Yeah. Perfectionism appears to be a really enduring characteristic in individuals with anorexia, often present even before the onset of the illness, persisting throughout it, and often remaining a significant factor even after recovery.
So it's not just a symptom of the illness, it's more fundamental.
It seems to be more of an underlying trait. The intense drive for extreme thinness itself can be viewed as a manifestation of this underlying perfectionistic personality style.
Right.
Exactly, ultimately contributing to feelings of depression and alienation. Or in intimate relationships, where holding unrealistic expectations for both oneself and one's partner can breed significant dissatisfaction and conflict.
Yeah.
Even in sports where you might think a drive for perfection would be beneficial, the intense fear of failure can actually limit performance, and the constant external measurement through scores and rankings can create excessive and debilitating pressure.
And the sheer list of potential medical complications and associated risks we found is quite extensive as well. It goes beyond mental health.
Yes, perfectionism is increasingly recognized as a significant risk factor for a wide range of conditions. We're talking obsessive-compulsive disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, various eating disorders, social anxiety disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, workaholism, self-harm and suicide, substance abuse, clinical depression, and even cardiovascular diseases like heart disease.
Heart disease, wow.
Yeah. Some studies have even indicated a higher overall mortality rate associated with individuals who score high on measures of perfectionism, potentially due to the elevated levels of chronic stress and worry that often accompany this personality style.
Okay, so given all of these potentially negative implications and consequences, what are some general therapeutic approaches that might be used to address perfectionism? How do people get help?
Well, therapists often focus on helping individuals identify and challenge the negative all-or-nothing thinking patterns that are so common in perfectionism.
Black and white thinking.
Exactly. They work with clients to encourage the setting of more realistic and achievable goals and to gradually confront their underlying fear of failure through behavioral experiments.
Trying things out even if they might not be perfect.
Right. But for lasting change to occur, it's really essential to address the deeper underlying issues of self-esteem and the core emotional beliefs that fuel and maintain perfectionistic tendencies. It's not just about changing behaviors.
And does perfectionism itself have an impact on whether or not someone seeks or benefits from psychological treatment? Does it get in the way of getting help?
Unfortunately, yes. Research suggests that perfectionism can actually make it more difficult for individuals to initially seek help, to remain engaged in therapy, and ultimately to fully benefit from the treatment process.
Why is that?
Well, unfavorable attitudes and beliefs about seeking psychological help can act as a significant barrier. When perfectionists do enter therapy, particularly those who are highly concerned with how they present themselves to others.
The self-presentational aspect again.
Right. They may find the initial intake sessions anxiety-provoking and tend to judge their own performance in therapy quite harshly.
And wow.
Perfectionism can also affect treatment adherence, with some research suggesting that higher levels of other-oriented perfectionism, for example, might be associated with a greater likelihood of dropping out of therapy.
Because they're critical of the therapist.
Potentially, or the process isn't meeting their perfect standard. Furthermore, the very nature of perfectionism, the tendency to present a flawless image, the reluctance to disclose perceived imperfections out of fear of judgment, and the underlying difficulties with interpersonal connection can hinder the development of a strong and trusting therapeutic alliance.
Which is crucial for therapy.
Absolutely. It's a crucial factor in successful treatment outcomes.
It was interesting to see that our sources also touched on the connection between perfectionism and narcissism. How do those relate?
Yes, according to the psychoanalytic theorist Arnold Cooper, narcissism can, in some ways, be understood as a self-perceived form of perfectionism that's often rooted in early experiences of trauma to the individual's grandiose sense of self.
Yeah.
More contemporary research has supported this connection, with studies finding links between different forms of perfectionism and both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism.
So there's overlap.
There seems to be. They often share this underlying aspect of contingent self-worth, a deep-seated need for constant external validation to feel adequate. Narcissists may also exhibit what's been termed pseudo-perfectionism.
Pseudo-perfectionism.
Yeah, where they need to be the center of attention and often create situations where they receive admiration and praise, further blurring the lines between these two constructs. It looks like perfectionism, but the motivation is different.
Got it. And how does perfectionism fit into the broader landscape of general personality traits? We mentioned the big five earlier.
Right. Within Cattell's older 16 personality factors model, perfectionism aligns with factors like being organized, compulsive, self-disciplined, and exacting.
Okay.
In the more widely used Big Five model, perfectionism can be seen as existing along a continuum of conscientiousness, with highly perfectionistic individuals often scoring at the extreme high end of that trait.
But it's not just high conscientiousness.
No. It's also important to note that perfectionism, particularly the aspect of perfectionist concerns, tends to show a stronger positive correlation with neuroticism.
Ah, the anxiety link.
Exactly, suggesting a link to increased anxiety and negative emotionality, whereas perfectionist strivings show a somewhat stronger association with conscientiousness itself.
It's also quite prevalent in younger populations, which is a bit concerning, as you mentioned.
That's absolutely right. Estimates suggest that perfectionism affects a significant proportion of children and adolescents, somewhere in the range of 25% to 30%.
A quarter to a third, wow.
Yeah. And just as we see in adults, it acts as a significant vulnerability factor for a range of negative outcomes during these critical developmental years. There's even a specific assessment tool, the Child-Adolescent Perfectionism Scale, CAPS, which is designed to measure self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism in this age group.
So we can measure it specifically in kids. Finally, let's circle back to specific treatment approaches. We mentioned general strategies, but what are some of the specific types of therapy that have been found to be helpful?
Sure. Several different therapeutic modalities have shown promise in addressing perfectionism. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is often used.
CBT, yeah.
To help individuals identify and challenge their irrational and unhelpful thinking patterns, and to develop more adaptive and flexible ways of approaching their goals and dealing with setbacks. Psychodynamic therapy and interpersonal therapy often focus on exploring the underlying relational patterns and early life experiences that may have contributed to the development and maintenance of perfectionism, aiming for more long-lasting and fundamental changes in personality and relational styles.
Looking at the roots.
Exactly. Exposure and response prevention, or ERP, which is also a core component in the treatment of obsessive-compulsive disorder, can be adapted to help individuals gradually stop engaging in perfectionistic behaviors in specific tasks, thereby reducing the anxiety associated with imperfection.
So facing the fear of being imperfect.
In a controlled way, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, acceptance-based behavior therapies, or ABBT, such as acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and dialectical behavior therapy.
ACT and DBT, okay.
Focus on increasing an individual's awareness and acceptance of their imperfections and difficult emotions, while also promoting engagement in values-driven and meaningful life activities. These approaches have shown promising results in reducing anxiety, depression, and social phobia, often associated with perfectionism, with effects that can be quite lasting.
This has truly been a deep dive into a topic that is clearly far more complex and often more detrimental than it initially appears.
Absolutely. I think the key takeaways are that perfectionism is a multifaceted personality trait with significant implications for both psychological and even physical well-being.
Yeah.
It's really crucial to distinguish it from simply striving for excellence,
Hmm.
as the relentless, self-critical, and often other-focused nature of perfectionism frequently leads to more harm than good in the long run.
And for you, the listener, we hope this exploration has provided some valuable insights, perhaps even some aha moments, helping you to better understand maybe your own tendencies or those you may observe in the people around you.
And this raises a really important question for us to consider as we wrap up. Given the documented increase in perfectionism, particularly among younger
Yeah,
generations,
maybe that rising trend.
what are the broader societal implications of this trend? And how can we, as a society, collectively shift our focus towards more sustainable and healthier ways of striving, and perhaps even more importantly, towards cultivating greater self-compassion and acceptance of imperfection, both in ourselves and in the world around us?
That's a great question to leave people with.
It's definitely something worth reflecting on in the context of the many pressures we all face.